We are in June 1912, in the southwestern part of the state of Iowa, in the town of Villisca, which today has barely more than 1,000 inhabitants, but at the time was home to around 2,500 people. It was here that the relatively well-to-do Moore family lived. According to local folklore, the name of the town means beautiful place or pleasant view, and in the early 1900s, Villisca was a distinctly prosperous settlement, with shops lining its streets. Interestingly, in 1912, an armory for the army was built here from public donations, and considering its size, Villisca also had a surprisingly significant military past. The town contributed substantially to the 1916 Pancho Villa expedition, and later to both the First and Second World Wars. During the latter, Montgomery County, of which Villisca is a part, lost more people per capita than any other county in the United States. Returning to the Moore family, the parents were 43-year-old Josiah Moore, known as Joe, and his wife Sarah, aged 39, born with the surname Montgomery in Knox County, Illinois. They lived here with their children, 11-year-old Herman Montgomery, 10-year-old Mary Catherine, 7-year-old Arthur Boyd, and 5-year-old Paul Vernon. The couple had married just under 13 years earlier, on December 6, 1899, in the home of Sarah's family. The well-respected family attended the local Presbyterian congregation, a Protestant church of Scottish origin. On Sunday, June 9, 1912, the church held a year-end school celebration and Children's Day service, the organization of which also involved Sarah Moore. An important detail is that earlier that day, 10-year-old Mary Catherine invited two of her friends to spend the night at the Moore house, 8-year-old Ina Mae Stillinger and 12-year-old Lena Gertrude Stillinger, who lived nearby. After receiving permission from their parents, the girls went together with the Moore family to church. The two visiting girls, who had 7 additional siblings, were born on their family's farm near Villisca. On June 9th, they left home early for church. After the morning service, the plan was to have lunch at their mother's house, spend the afternoon with her, and then, after the Children's Day event, return there to spend the night. In the end, however, they were invited by their friend to stay over, so they would not have to walk alone in the dark. As a result, Joe Moore called the Stillinger household around 6 o'clock in the evening and spoke with Blanche, the girl's older sister. She informed him that their parents, Joseph and Sarah Stillinger, were outside the house, but that she would pass on the message. I mention all of this deliberately in order to sacrifice as much as possible on the altar of detail. What is certain is that at the event, which began at 8 o'clock in the evening, the children performed short plays and recitations. This was followed by a standing reception and conversation, which ended around 9:30 p.m., while outside the weather was unusually cloudy, cool, and damp for a summer night. Since this was a small town and a close-knit community, distances were short. The Presbyterian church was only 3 blocks from the Moore home. After the event ended, they headed straight home, arriving sometime between 9:45 and 10 p.m. Tragically, their departure marked the last time the 2 parents, their 4 children, and the 2 visiting girls were ever seen alive. The disaster did not strike immediately. Based on the evidence, the children ate some cake and drank a small amount of milk before going to bed. After that, however, something truly horrific happened inside the house, without a single sound being heard by anyone in the surrounding area. The next morning, Monday, June 10th, around 7 a.m., an elderly neighbor living to the west of the Moore house, a woman named Mary Peckham, noticed something unusual while hanging laundry beside her home. Contrary to their normal routine, the Moore family had not come outside to perform their usual household chores, such as tending to the animals. The silence was overwhelming, and the house appeared abandoned. Growing increasingly concerned, the elderly woman knocked on the suspiciously quiet house, but received no response despite repeated attempts. She then tried to open the door, but it was locked. She released the chickens and checked on the horses as well, but they were still tied up. At this point, she called Joe Moore's brother, Ross Moore, a pharmacist living in Villisca, to report that something might be wrong. Soon, people began making phone calls in all directions. When Ross Moore arrived around 8 a.m., he also knocked and shouted into the house, but to no avail. Finally, he took out a spare key he carried for security purposes and unlocked the door. Ross Moore began searching the house, while Mary Peckham remained on the porch. The first room Ross entered was the entryway. From there, he opened the door to the downstairs guest room, where he found the bodies of the 2 neighboring girls, Ina and Lena Stillinger, lying on the bed, covered with blankets. The bed frame was soaked in blood. Ross stepped back in shock and ran outside to Mary Peckham, urging her to immediately call for Henry Horton, known as Hank Horton, the town marshal, telling her that something very terrible has happened. Town marshals at the time had roughly the same law enforcement authority as a sheriff, except their jurisdiction was limited to the town itself rather than the entire county. Horton was eventually located after Mary Peckham first called Ed Selly, an employee at the Moore family's hardware store, and asked him to find the marshal. Once he was found, they went to the scene together. The marshal arrived around 8:30 a.m. and walked through the house. Upon coming back outside, he told Ross Moore only this: someone was murdered in every bed. Everyone who could be reached was alerted, but according to accounts, a small number of authorities quickly lost control of the crime scene. Such a crime was shocking not only for a town this small, but anywhere, and word spread immediately that something dreadful had happened in the Moore house. Because Villisca was a small yet tightly knit community, a large crowd soon gathered around the building. The chaos and lack of coordination were so severe that, according to some reports, as many as 100 curious onlookers walked through the house before the National Guard finally cordoned off the area around noon. What investigators did establish was that the entire Moore family, along with the 2 visiting girls, 8 people in total, were murdered in their sleep by an unknown assailant or assailants. Leaning against the south wall of the downstairs room, beside the bodies of the 2 girls, they found the murder weapon, the axe belonging to Joe Moore, taken from the backyard and carefully cleaned. According to the medical examiner, the brutal murders likely occurred sometime between midnight and 3 a.m. Most frightening of all was the realization that the perpetrator or perpetrators likely entered the house while the family was still at the Children's Day event. They may have waited in the attic, a theory supported by the discovery of 2 cigarette butts found there later. This was especially notable because no one in the Moore family smoked. The massacre began in the parents' bedroom with Joe and Sarah Moore. Joe was treated with the greatest brutality. He received far more blows from the axe than any of the other victims, so many that one of his eyes was missing. This was likely because, as the only adult male, he was the only one capable of offering real resistance. While the blunt side of the axe was used on the other victims, Joe Moore was beaten to death with the blade. After the parents' room, the killer or killers moved to the bedroom of the 4 children, aged between 5 and 11, and murdered them all as well. Evidence suggests that the attacker then returned once more to the parents' bedroom to strike them again. During this time, Sarah Moore's bloody shoes, both the soles and the interiors, were kicked aside toward her husband's body, where she was later found lying on her side. Around 9 a.m., Dr. Lindquist, the county coroner, arrived at the scene. He believed the killer may have accidentally knocked Sarah Moore's body over when returning to the bedroom a second time. Finally, the perpetrator went downstairs to the guest room where the 2 Stillinger girls were sleeping. Ina lay closer to the wall, while Lena was on the right. Investigators believed Lena may have been awake when she was attacked, as she was found lying crosswise on the bed with what appeared to be a defensive wound on her arm. In addition, her nightgown was pulled up to waist level, and she was not wearing underwear. At first, investigators believed the killer may have attempted sexual assault, but one of the medical examiners, Dr. F.S. Williams, ultimately found no concrete evidence of forced penetration. According to the examinations, all 8 victims, including the children, received at least 20 to 30 blows each. Investigators also found marks on the ceilings of the upstairs bedrooms belonging to the parents and their children, scratches that looked almost like chisel work, which, according to detectives, could have been caused by the axe striking down with terrifying force. Before leaving, the perpetrator or perpetrators covered the windows that had no curtains with clothing, aprons, and skirts, and drew the curtains on the other windows so that no one could see in from outside. After death, they covered the heads of every victim with blankets, and they also wiped the bloody axe clean to some extent. Strangely, however, the killer left something else behind. Beside the axe, propped against the wall, there was a 1.8 kilogram slab of bacon wrapped in a kitchen towel. On the kitchen table, investigators found an unfinished dinner and a dishpan filled with bloody water. Curiously, an identical piece of meat of the same weight was found in the icebox. All of this suggested that after the murders, the perpetrator spent some additional time inside the Moore home, washed up, and even wanted to eat. They also found a kerosene lamp without its cover at the foot of the parents' bed, which could not have gone out long before. A similar lamp was discovered by the Stillinger girls' bed as well. Pieces of a keychain were found on the floor of the downstairs guest room, even though every door and window was locked, yet it was never clarified who the keychain belonged to. Finally, around noon, the county attorney named Ratcliffe gave permission for the bodies to be removed. They were taken to a makeshift morgue set up at the Villisca fire station, but even that grim work was not finished until 2 o'clock in the morning. The family and the 2 visiting girls were buried 2 days later, on June 12, 1912. The funeral service was held in Villisca's main square, attended by several thousand people, so many that the National Guard had to control the crowd as they moved toward the local fire station, where the 8 victims lay. The coffins were transported to the cemetery in several wagons, and their honor escort stretched 50 wagons long. The unnaturally silent house and the unknown wallpaper cleaners before. Journalists and private detectives flooded the streets, and from the day of the murders onward, the residents of the tiny community began locking their doors again. Rumors poisoned everyday life, while law enforcement agencies from neighboring counties and nearby states joined the investigation, bringing with them dozens of bloodhounds. In the first stage of the investigation, when the trail might still have been hot, authorities questioned 14 eyewitnesses. Of those, I will now recount only the ones that add new information compared to what has been covered so far. The first person questioned was the elderly neighbor, Mary Peckham. She always woke up very early because she worked at the local cemetery, doing maintenance, upkeep, and similar tasks. According to her statement, she did see the family leave for church on that Sunday afternoon, but she went to bed around 8 o'clock, so she did not notice them returning home. What may be slightly surprising, however, is that she did not hear a single sound from her next-door neighbors, despite the fact that 8 people were butchered with an axe barely 30 meters away. That fact, along with the method of the crime as a whole, suggested that the killer or killers had not done something like this for the first time. She also said she went outside to hang laundry sometime between 5 and 6 in the morning, and by 7 o'clock, the strangely silent house had begun to feel suspicious, which is understandable, considering 4 children lived there. Her testimony also revealed that although every door and window was locked, no key was found in any lock, meaning the killer could have taken the keys after locking everything up. Next came Ed Selly, an employee, who testified that before he needed to alert the marshal, he had spoken by phone with the murdered father's brother, who was asking about Joe's whereabouts while Selly was preparing to open the store. Selly then called the head of the family's parents as well in case Joe had gone to see them, but Joe Moore's mother gave a negative answer. After that, he claimed he received a call from Mary Peckham too, asking whether he had seen Joe and telling him that someone needed to tend to the Moore's animals. So Selly left the store and went to feed the horses in the barn, horses belonging to a family that was, at that very moment, lying in blood behind the walls. When he returned to the store, he received the call telling him to find the marshal, because by then, Ross Moore had entered the house. As he said, he later went into the building himself, but the moment he saw the blood in the downstairs bedroom, he came back out. Then, leaving the house, he notified the Moores' largest business partner, the John Deere branch in Omaha. What is especially interesting is that when asked by the police, Selly named Joe Moore's brother-in-law, a man named Sam Moyer, as someone who might have borne ill will toward the head of the household. Joe Moore had once told Selly that this brother-in-law did not like him and that something might come of it, but Selly had no more information about the nature of their relationship. The next person questioned was a medical examiner named Dr. J. Clark Cooper. The marshal ran to his office at around 8:45 and said only one ominous thing: "Come with me." Cooper entered the house together with another doctor named Dr. Ho, the marshal, and a Presbyterian minister named Mr. Ewing. Cooper stated that they did not notice any strange smells inside, and he did not add much that was new compared to what had already been said. However, he was the one who established that the victims were covered after their deaths, since no textile residue was found in any of their wounds, and no torn or damaged blankets were found anywhere. He also said that although everyone inside knew the family well, no one could recognize them, an indicator in itself of how brutally they had been executed. It was also Dr. Cooper who determined, based on blood evidence and the condition of internal organs, such as the state of the brain, that they had died roughly 5 to 6 hours earlier, meaning most likely sometime between 2 and 3 in the morning. Although the doctor did examine the condition of the brains, I will not go into that in too much detail. Essentially, he drew conclusions from the degree of dehydration. It is also worth mentioning Jessie Moore, the wife of Ross Moore, the brother. She heard about the murders from one of the neighbors who arrived at the scene. Although she could not add much in her testimony beyond the fact that she too spoke that morning with Ed Selly, she did say that later in the day, she entered the house to collect family photographs for the press. We must also mention a man named Edward Landers, who had come to visit his mother, who lived nearby, and who lived directly across the street from the Moore house. He and his wife arrived home around 8:30 that evening after working all day at a downtown restaurant, and according to his recollection, they got into bed around 9. But before he could fall asleep, sometime around 11, he he heard a loud, human-made sound outside. He described it as if one boy were hooting at another, and not long after that, he also heard rustling from the bushes nearby. After he fell asleep, he noticed nothing unusual and did not wake up. When he heard about the murders the next day, he began to think that those sounds might even have come from a woman. He also said that his wife, Ethel Landers, had seen two unknown men in town and around the Moore house early Saturday morning. Men who claimed to be wallpaper cleaners. Strangely, no one had ever seen them there before, and no one ever saw them there again afterward. One was a short man, while the other was taller and stockier. Ethel also said the two men approached their house, but it was her husband who went out onto the porch to speak with them, and they merely asked whether there might be any work available. From the Saturday before the murders, it may also be important to mention the account of a man named Mr. B.C. Hullinger, who said that around 8:30 that evening, an unknown man with a foreign accent and a dark gaze approached him to ask about routes leading toward nearby towns. Authorities also questioned one of Joe Moore's brothers, Charles Moore, who added that the murdered head of household had a habit of locking the door from the inside, whether they were leaving the house or preparing to go to bed. This meant the killer was not greeted by open doors. He had to break in somehow without leaving traces and still lock everything again afterward. The search initially focused on an unknown man who one day before the murders, on Saturday morning around 11:30, asked a 16-year-old girl named Faye Van Gilder, completely by chance, Sarah Moore's niece, for directions to the Moore house near the local high school. And there were indeed suspicious figures who seemed to fit the picture. One of them was a man named Joe Ricks, who was arrested on June 15, 1912, in Monmouth, Illinois, after stepping off a train wearing bloody shoes. When word was sent down to Villisca that a suspicious man had been detained, the young girl, her mother Emma Van Gilder, and the county attorney Ratcliffe traveled to Monmouth to identify him. However, when the girl was confronted with the man, she declared that he was not the one. Joe Ricks claimed he had arrived from Clarinda, and in the absence of evidence, he had to be released. The bloody shoes, he said, had been traded earlier with a tramp. Interestingly, the girl admitted that she had told Sarah Moore, before the murders, that a stranger had been asking about them, and Sarah had reportedly replied that she had seen someone matching that description lurking around their house over the weekend. The mysterious man, however, was never found. His description also did not survive. Among the suspects, one of the most famous was a man named Andrew Sawyer. What was most interesting about him was not so much his identity, because he had an alibi and was cleared, but rather what he said. A man named Thomas Dyer from Burlington, a construction foreman for the local railway company, stated in his testimony that Sawyer appeared at their place at 6 a.m. on the day of the murders, looking for work in Creston, east of Villisca. Dyer described Sawyer as freshly shaved and wearing a brown coat, with muddy shoes and trousers wet up to the knees. He was given work because they needed an extra man. Later, toward the end of the day, when they reached Fontenelle, Sawyer bought a newspaper containing reports about the Villisca murders and read it in seclusion. Strangely, that evening, he slept in his clothes, kept his axe beside him, and looked as if he were afraid to be left alone. He spoke often about the murders and whether the killer had been caught. On June 18, more than a week after the crime, Dyer reported the suspicious man to the county sheriff. But before the sheriff arrived, something happened. Dyer once approached Sawyer from behind and saw him sitting with his head buried in his hands. Suddenly, Sawyer sprang up and screamed at himself, "I'm gonna cut your head off," and began waving his axe. Later, Dyer's son told the authorities that Sawyer had told him, while they were driving through Villisca, that he could show where the killer had escaped the town. Sawyer claimed the unknown man jumped over a manure pit, and while saying this, he pointed to a specific spot about a block away. He even showed where the person allegedly crossed the railroad tracks. What is especially interesting is that Dyer's sons later checked that location and did indeed find footprints in the soaked ground north of the railroad embankment. Sawyer then told the boy that if he looked to the other side of the car, he would see an old tree where the killer stepped into a creek. Not long after, such a tree really did come into view, an eerie detail, considering Sawyer had arrived looking for work with muddy shoes and trousers wet to the knees. In the end, however, Sawyer was cleared. He was able to prove he had not been in Villisca at the time of the murders, a fact also confirmed by a sheriff from Osceola, Iowa, who had arrested him for vagrancy in time after the Children's Day event, 113 kilometers east of Villisca, and had put him on a train at 11 p.m. It is also important to talk about Lynn George Jacqueline Kelly, a Presbyterian itinerant preacher born in England, who immigrated to America in 1904 with his wife, attended the Children's Day event and was even brought to trial because of this case. It is known that the man, considered strange by many, suffered a nervous breakdown in his youth. As an adult, he was accused of peeping on others in the literal peep show sense, and at other times of requesting nude photographs from young women and girls. In the United States, he preached before Methodist congregations in North Dakota, Minnesota, Kansas, and Iowa as well. He arrived in Villisca on the morning of the murders, Sunday, for the event, where he almost certainly watched the Stillinger children's performance. He left the town not long after the murders at 5:19 a.m. on the westbound number 5 train. Allegedly, during the journey, when no one else could yet have known, he told several other passengers, 8 souls are departed in Villisca. 2 weeks later he returned, and the most shocking part is that he presented himself as a detective and even managed to join an investigative group, whose members were taken through the crime scene. His fascination with the case did not fade with time. He bombarded the authorities and the victims' family members with letters until one investigator finally replied and asked George Kelly for details, because there were letters in which Kelly explicitly identified himself as the perpetrator. The mentally disturbed man possessed strikingly accurate information, which was hardly surprising given that he had slipped into the house, yet the authorities could not decide whether he had truly committed the horrors or merely believed he had. At one point, they did place him under official investigation, but in the end nothing came of it for lack of evidence. 2 years later, however, they caught him again, this time for harassing a woman who had applied to him for a secretary job. He was ultimately sent to a psychiatric facility in Washington, D.C., and at that moment, investigators once again began to consider his possible involvement. So in 1917, they took him into custody yet again. The interrogation lasted for hours. He confessed his guilt and even signed a written confession on August 31st, claiming he heard voices and that God inspired him that the children must suffer in order to come to him. But at the September trial, he retracted every statement he had made. Even so, of the jurors, 11 found him guilty and only 1 did not, so no verdict was reached. A second jury was appointed quickly afterward, but in November they acquitted him as well, because once again there simply was not enough evidence. One of the most intriguing theories surrounding the case does not actually connect to just one person, but to several, and it is entirely possible it is not merely a theory. The idea is that these 8 innocent people may in truth have been killed by a serial murderer, someone who was cutting a similar path through the American Midwest with the same methods. And as I said, more than one name enters the frame. One of them is a man named William Mansfield, who, 2 years after the Villisca massacre, killed his wife, his newborn child, and his parents-in-law with an axe in Blue Island, Illinois. He was also a suspect in a Kansas axe massacre that took place 4 days before Villisca, and he has been linked as well to the killing of 2 women in Illinois. All of these murders were carried out in a similar manner, and every crime scene was located near a railroad. So, according to the first theory, this William Mansfield may have been hired by an Iowa state senator named Frank Fernando Jones to eliminate the family. Joe Moore, the father, had worked for years in the senator's business, but after leaving in 1908, he founded his own. The problem was that Moore's store quickly began to outgrow the politicians. Joe Moore snatched away major deals from Senator Jones, and those deals laid the foundation of the family's wealth. One of those deals was that when Joe left, he took the entire John Deere franchise and its products with him. According to this scenario, jealousy may have been the engine behind the atrocity. There were also rumors that Joe Moore might have had an affair with the senator's daughter-in-law, Donna, though no evidence was ever found to support it. Mansfield, who during his criminal career also appeared under the aliases George Worley and Jack Turnbaugh, did not enter the picture by accident, even though there is no evidence that he ever met the politician. This supposed serial killer was arrested more than once for various crimes, but he consistently had an alibi, and charges were never filed. Beyond the cases already mentioned, he was also suspected in a quadruple murder in Colorado Springs that occurred 9 months before Villisca, where the windows were likewise covered, this time with bed sheets, and where the bloody axe was wiped down, and the victims' faces were covered, just the same. A private detective named James Newton Wilkerson went even further, because he identified additional similarities across the earlier cases. For example, the perpetrator reportedly left a kerosene lamp burning with its lid open at the foot of a bed at every scene. Likewise, a wash basin was found in the kitchen everywhere, where the killer typically cleaned himself up, and in none of the cases did anyone find fingerprints, suggesting that the killer likely always wore gloves. Mansfield, for instance, may have done this deliberately because his fingerprints were registered at the federal military prison in Leavenworth. And precisely because his own family had been killed in a similar manner, the force of these similarities allowed Mansfield to be brought to court in 1916, 4 years after the events. Yet he was able to present evidence, such as payroll documents, showing that at the time of the Villisca murders, he was supposedly in Illinois. Interestingly, Mansfield later sued the investigator who had connected the threads and was awarded $2,225 in damages, an amount inflated to today's value of $53,000, meaning nearly 15.7 million forints. The story also includes the fact that the investigator, forced to pay the damages later, claimed Mansfield had been released under pressure from the state senator, and that George Kelly, the preacher, was later summoned to court as well. Another twist might have been this: an owner of a restaurant in Shenandoah, a town near Villisca, a man named R.H. Thorpe, specifically identified Mansfield. He claimed he saw the man board a train in Clarinda, south of Villisca, on the morning of the murders. He added that the Mansfield he identified arrived on foot from the direction of Villisca. Strangely, however, because Mansfield was later cleared, this testimony ultimately carried little weight in the investigation. Still, I would add one more detail to this political thread. As mentioned earlier, after the murders, they brought scent-tracking dogs to Villisca, specifically the bloodhounds of the then-famous breeder Elmer Nofsinger from Beatrice, Nebraska. The dogs managed to pick up the killer's scent from the axe and from the wiping rag used to clean it. They started out heading east, then almost immediately turned north, first onto South 6th Street, then at the corner turned west onto East 1st Street, where they stopped at the intersection with North 5th. Want to guess whose house stood there? None other than Senator Frank Fernando Jones's. According to Detective Wilkerson, the dogs strained against their leashes, tugging their handlers, trying to reach the building. Others claimed it was simply nature calling them. But the question arises, all the dogs at once? After that, the animals continued west, with the crowd following behind them. Then at the fourth corner turned south toward the railroad tracks, crossed them, and then headed east, all the way to the Nottoway River. Beyond the river, they could no longer recover the scent, and the next day the dogs were taken back to Nebraska. In any case, what this suggested was that the killer passed by the senator's house, then after making a loop, turned back in the direction of the crime scene, crossed the river, and from there into the darkness. That was one serial killer theory. Now comes the next. This one centers on a man named Paul Mueller, a German immigrant who arrived in the United States at the end of the 19th century, and who was first examined in the 2017 book The Man from the Train by author Bill James and his daughter Rachel. They too interpreted the Villisca horror as part of a series of murders, and their number one suspect became Paul Mueller, who, as a German immigrant, unsurprisingly spoke with an accent. After all, a man like that appeared in the town the night before the murders, asking for directions. The Jameses began their work by reviewing countless contemporary reports and newspaper articles, because there truly were an almost extraordinary number of axe murders in the 1910s, crimes in which entire families were not rarely wiped out. Moreover, authorities were already hunting Paul Mueller as early as 1897, when he became the prime suspect in a massacre in West Brookfield, Massachusetts, where a family was slaughtered with an axe, after Mueller himself had worked on their farm. According to the authors, Mueller may be responsible for at least 59 deaths across 14 separate crimes. They also included among these the Colorado Springs, Kansas, and Illinois murders previously linked to William Mansfield. Across those 14 crimes, including the one in Villisca and the one on the Massachusetts farm, the similarities were consistent. A railway line nearby, the victims attacked after they had gone to sleep, the victim's own axe used and then left behind, and the murders committed mostly with the blunt side of the axe, targeting the victims' faces and heads. The window covering and the covering of the victims' heads were also identical everywhere. And in many places there were signs suggesting sexual harassment, just as in Villisca, and it still does not end there. Another figure entered the picture, a man named Henry Lee Moore, born in Missouri in 1874, who was only a namesake of the victims, yet he too was connected to axe murders carried out across the American Midwest. What's more, he was actually convicted of murdering his own mother, Georgia Ann Moore, and his maternal grandmother, Mary Wilson, an event that occurred only a few months after Villisca, under the same conditions, with the murder weapon once again being an axe. His father, Enoch Moore, had fought in the American Civil War and later worked as a farmer, while his mother was a nurse. Of his father's and siblings circle, two, Tilden and Turner, had died before 1910, while a third brother, Charles, had left home even before Henry Lee Moore carried out the killings of his mother and grandmother. As for Henry Lee Moore himself, it is known that he worked on a farm in Franklin County, Iowa, and during that period it was suspected that he impregnated one of the farmer's younger daughters. It also emerged that he had been imprisoned for document forgery at the state prison in Hutchinson, Kansas, from which he was released on April 11, 1911. The Colorado Springs murders mentioned earlier also took place that same year, in September. He spent the winter of 1911 and the summer of 1912 at his mother's, and then, in the summer of 1912, before the horrors of Villisca took place, he left to take a railroad job. A court sentenced him to life in prison for killing his mother and grandmother in December 1912, but in 1956 the sentence was reduced and he was released at the age of 82. After that, he disappeared from the authorities. It is not known when or where he died. According to police, he may have had as many as 25 victims. The final confession and the underworld contract. In the years after the murders, many more disturbing developments occurred, things we have to talk about. The first took place on March 19, 1917, in Red Oak, Iowa, when a preacher named J.J. Burris from Terrellton, Oklahoma, was summoned by the court to testify. In his testimony, the pastor claimed that a man, whose name he could no longer recall, had confessed to him on his deathbed that, according to him, the dying man made this confession in a hotel in Radersburg, Montana, and ultimately died from a severe alcohol withdrawal syndrome. The preacher said that the moment he entered the room of the dying man, who seemed to be about 25 years old, the man immediately began confessing his sins, and it was already clear he stood at the threshold of death. But he had little strength left, he could barely speak, and not long afterward he died. In any case, the preacher also claimed that the man had lived in Villisca at the time of the murders, had worked there for a while as a blacksmith, and that he still had relatives living there. The investigator who had been forced to pay damages pursued this story as well, but in the end, he could not authenticate it. Then, in 1931, another man confessed to the murders, a 48-year-old man from Detroit named George Myers, who at the time was already behind bars for robbery. Myers claimed, after a 5-hour interrogation that authorities initiated based on a tip from one of his fellow inmates, that a businessman had hired him to wipe out the Moore family. The price, he said, was $5,000, adjusted to today's value $131,000. He also said he did not know the family, that the businessman's approach came through an underworld contact, and that he demanded a $2,000 advance for the job. This unknown person allegedly took him to Villisca to meet the client, and later Myers claimed he received the remaining money as well. But there is a fatal flaw in this story. George Myers only confessed to 6 murders, 2 adults and 4 children. When they told him that 8 people were killed in Villisca, he denied that he had harmed the 2 Stillinger girls. The investigation into the massacre lasted nearly 10 years. The horrific event sent such serious shockwaves that it was followed by multiple state-level legislative changes affecting public safety. They also established the predecessor of what is still operating today, the Iowa State Bureau of Investigation. Nevertheless, and keeping in mind that it was 1912, DNA samples and DNA testing were not even imaginable. Fingerprint identification was still close to a novelty, and there was no central database, for example. So even demonstrating a potential match would have been nearly impossible. On top of that, the poor initial securing of the crime scene likely led to the destruction of many key pieces of evidence. One thing that might have helped was that another local pharmacist tried to enter the house with a camera, but authorities threw him out. In the 1990s, the Moore family's house, the murder scene, was renovated to look exactly as it had before the crime. After that, it was declared a historical landmark. That means the state is responsible for its continued maintenance and preservation. The case is considered one of the bloodiest slaughters not only in Iowa, but in the entire United States. But after so much time, 109 years, there is very little chance it will ever be solved. The identity of the killer will most likely never come to light.